Hello everybody, welcome back to punkwrite. My name is Smee. Today I had a very special guest, my friend and colleague, Mr. Matthew Sheets. We're here to talk about history. Why do you read history? What's its value? And how do you get through those big-ass books? We're live. Welcome everybody to punkwrite. I've had very long and extensive conversations with my colleague here because sometimes he rags on me about my desire and love to read fiction, but he forgets that I too started my reading, mostly reading nonfiction. As a philosophy major, I spent a lot of time getting through sometimes very difficult and thick books. The question is, why do you read those books, and how actually do you get through them efficiently so that you can learn what you're talking about?
So I would say that I was a pretty terrible high school student that was much more interested in doing other things besides sitting in the classroom. And then I guess when...
You don't need to go into that right now.
No, true. And then when you work shitty jobs for 4 or 5 years after high school, you realize maybe I do need education. And in that transition period, starting to kind of re-pick up history books that I was always interested in, realizing how much there is to learn in the world, how little you know, and how much perspective, how many ideas you can gain from reading what most people consider a big-ass, long, boring history book.
Yeah, I'm going to interject there because my memories of high school history, which was pretty much restricted to American history, we didn't get any kind of universal history at all, was rote memorization. It was some sort of adherence to fact and to events, but there was very little engagement with the material that I remember. So how do you find some means of actually getting yourself into the text and making it accessible to your own sometimes limited knowledge on the topic so that you're not overwhelmed and you can actually gain something from it?
So I think all of us in our daily lives have questions. We see things on the news, we experience things in our lives, we see events happening around us, and we wonder, wait, what? What's going on? Why'd that happen? How'd that happen? Why are things how they are? And I would argue quite heavily that most things can be understood if we look at where they came from. Looking at where they come from obviously involves understanding the history of those events, those constructs, those people, whatever you are looking at. So a lot of my history book reading comes from experience I have in my life, my not understanding those, or my wanting to further look into why things are how they are, why the world exists how it exists, and why people behave in the ways that they do.
So there's that cliche saying, oh, well, we need to learn history so that history doesn't repeat itself. Well, we all know that's kind of a load of BS because history has a way of always spotting around, and we do the same thing. The times are different, the situations are different, but the humans are the same. We have the same behaviors. Is understanding just enough? Just because you understand the events, what is the value that you have, or the inherent value that you can gain from that perspective of history?
Sure. I don't think you ever understand the event. We weren't there. We didn't live it. When you read a history book from a person that has a perspective that you did not grow up knowing, it can completely shift your thought on what has happened in the past and what is happening in the present. The first thing I would say when you start reading a history book is to forget what you think you know about the past. Because what we think we know is largely a product of where we grew up and who we interacted with. And if we read a textbook or a history book by a person that didn't share our same experiences, they have a very different idea of what, why, and how something happened. There is no real version of really what happened in the past. It's all an interpretation of the events, of the records, of what we have from that time.
Okay, so that begs the question about the truthfulness of the text that you're reading. If you're engaging in some, I guess, reconfiguration of facts and events that someone else has simply assembled in their own mind, how do we know that what you're reading is valuable enough to actually consider to be truthful?
Anything that is researched, that looks at primary sources, that actually has a perspective or attempts to better understand or explain why something happened in the past is what gives it value. Because there is no correct history. Reading different people's perspectives on what they view as the correct history gives us a much better understanding into why people have the ideas, opinions, and values that they do, and how those values have kind of percolated up through the past and become a part of who we are, whether we're aware of them influencing us or not.
But if there's no correct history, is it possible that history changes?
Absolutely. I think a crystal clear example is the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening up of Soviet archives, and they have completely allowed historians to reinterpret the Cold War, who's at fault, what role Stalin played, what did Truman do, what did America do, what did Russia do, was it really communism versus capitalism? All of those ideas have been unpacked, further expanded upon, simply because this monolithic country or collection of countries lost its kind of political power and thus allowed historians to go back in and gain access to archives that they would have never seen before. So there was stuff there that changed our historical knowledge that was sitting there that we couldn't access due to events that were not within our control. So I think history, it's always changing. If I asked you what happened yesterday, it would change from what happened the next day and the day after that. Our memory of events changes continually as we grow older.
Yeah, not only the memory though, too, it makes me reflect on this whole, the recent events in the last couple of years with George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and how the narrative around the African American history is taking a different spin and a different perspective in the last few years. I think when we read history books, the validity of those history books should always be at the forefront of your mind as a reader to think about, is what I'm reading true in this moment, or I guess what is the truth value of what I'm reading in this moment, and how will it change over time? And importantly for me as the reader, how is that going to affect me over time so that I have some perspective on the events that I'm reading about?
And there is bad history, there is garbage history, there is history that's not well researched, that takes events and manipulates them and lies about the facts that they claim to be reporting on. But even through crappy history that's not well written, that is intentionally biased, we can gain a whole bunch of knowledge about the person, the people, the group of people that then choose to read and interact with that kind of history. So bad history, good history, it all serves its purpose for helping us better understand, what is happening around us.
These books sometimes are very big and they can be onerous to get through. What are some of your suggestions in terms of the tenacity needed to get through a text of that length?
If you're not curious, you won't get through it. You have to be asking questions continually. You have to be thinking about what you're reading and what does it make you think? I would argue if you read a history book and you don't ask a question, then what's the point? Hopefully when you read about the past, you should naturally have these questions that come up. And if you don't, maybe pick up a book that's written by an author that has an opinion that's wildly different from yours. And simply by then looking at their opinion about the past and why it's different, you'll start to get those historical questions. Once you start getting those historical questions, you'll quickly realize that they'll spindle out and you'll end up with 45,000 questions from a 200-page book that now you can spend your time, researching. So you got to ask questions. You got to be curious. If you're not curious, you won't get through it.
And in my defense, even though I do love fiction, I think the same applies to fiction because in many respects, the author is putting together an assembly of characters that in many ways represent our humanity. Even though nonfiction books are supposedly placed around actual events, we still have a sense of exploration of who we are as human beings and how we fit into this world.
But you can't have the exploration unless you understand the context of the book.
Which is why you should read both. I'm all about both.
More nonfiction.
It's okay to read fiction.
It is if you're bored, but
the entertainment value is of a qualitatively different type. Let's put it that way.
It is. But yes, but I would argue that you can't truly grasp the brilliance of a fiction book unless you understand the context within which that book was written.
And on that note, we're going to end our video with punkwrite. Thanks for joining us today. Remember, you just keep on reading and keep on writing.
Nonfiction.
Punkwrite.